Welcome to Patrick Henry College's Newsmaker interview series. My name is Graham Walker. I'm the president of Patrick Henry College, and it's a pleasure to have you all here today. We are joined, of course, by many people tuning into our live webcast, and ultimately we'll be joined by the 400,000 some readers of World Magazine who will be enjoying these interviews in a written form. As our host, Dr. Marvin Olasky, writes them up and publishes them. As you know, Dr. Olasky is, of course, the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and also, more dear to our hearts, he is the holder of our distinguished chair in journalism and public policy here at Patrick Henry College. Thank you, Dr. Olasky, for bringing quite a remarkable series of guests to our campus this week. We've all learned a lot, and we're looking forward to more today. Today, Dr. Olasky has the privilege of interviewing Thomas Lake, and we're going to get with him a look into the world of big-time sports journalism. Mr. Lake, who was homeschooled through most of his youth, I understand, wrote his first newspaper story at age 17 and worked his way up through small and medium market newspapers to land at the St. Petersburg Times in 2006. While there, his story titled Dismembered Again, about gruesome insurance fraud in a small Florida town, won first place from the American Association of Sunday and Features Editors. That led to a freelance gig with Sports Illustrated, where his story 2 on 5 won the Henry Luce Award for Most Outstanding Story of 2008 for All Time Incorporated Publications, which is a large group of publications. Since then, 2 of his stories have been chosen for the annual Best American Sports Writing Anthology. Mr. Lake has built a track record of using investigative techniques to write stories that uncover good deeds and prove people right. Please welcome Thomas Lake.
Let's talk about homeschooling.
Yeah.
What was your experience?
Well, I was the third of 6 children, and my father, Robert Lake, was the pastor of a non-denominational church, and he and my mother, Elizabeth Lake, decided they wanted to teach us all at home, and so that's what they did. And
this is in upstate New York?
Well, we lived a few places. It started out in metro Atlanta,
okay.
But like many people here, many of the students here, I guess my mom and dad just wanted to be able to sort of be in charge of what we learned, but at the same time, leave it open to us and let us pursue what we were curious about. And so it was pretty free form, a lot of going to the library and, the whole pack of us in the station wagon, and we would check out something like 40 or 50 books at a time and just sit around reading them. And
familiar to some of you?
Yeah. So we had certain lesson plans involving learning math and all that, but a lot of it had to do with just pursuing our intellectual curiosity. And what's neat about that to me is, in a way, that's what I still do, and what I get paid to do is think of something I'm curious about and go find out the rest of the story. And it's a privilege to be able to do that.
What were some of your favorite books?
Growing up?
Growing up.
Sure. It went all over the place. And my older brother John and I literally used to sit around reading the encyclopedias sometimes,
World Book Encyclopedia?
The World Book, yes. Entries about coal or World War II. But I wasn't that boring. I really enjoyed the C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia series. That was very good. Lots of fantasy and science fiction, but also books about history. I loved World War II, was very fascinated by that. I remember it seemed like a bunch of times I checked out a book about the Dunkirk rescue operation in World War II, where a whole bunch of, I think several 100,000 British soldiers were trapped on a beach in France, and they were pinned there by the Germans and in serious need of rescue, and all of a sudden every boat you can think of came across the English Channel, warships, civilian boats, to rescue these men and bring them to safety. I remember being very fascinated by that.
Okay. And your favorite subject as you were growing up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would have to say it was literature, reading, uh, and that continues today. A lot of the best writers out there are novel writers or fiction writers. So if I've got a road trip to take for work, a lot of times I'll go to the library, take out a good book, read aloud on CD, and play that the whole way there and back. I find it gives me a really good frame of mind for my own writing.
And when did you start writing as a child? Is there a particular...
It's hard to say the exact age, but I do know that from a pretty early age, my mom encouraged us to keep journals and just write about what we saw. I can remember one time in particular where she told me and my siblings to go out in the yard and just write down everything we saw and heard and felt, and that was a great experience. I sometimes still do that, actually, and it's something that if you want to be a writer, you can try. You don't even have to go outside. You could just take 5 minutes, and the act of putting experience into words, it's a skill just like anything else, and the more you do it, the easier it gets and the better you can do it.
Yeah, so prospective writers should never, if let's say stuck standing in line, should never find that a boring experience, right?
Well,
because
we all have our limits. But.
So we have our limits. This is true, but nevertheless, being able to look at people, try to describe them, what their faces are, and so forth. These are all good things to do to develop as a writer.
It's very true. I mean, and yeah, sure, we all need a break, but something Ernest Hemingway said is, watch the way people get out of taxi cabs, and it's true. You want to be as sharp an observer as possible and learn how to use very specific and concrete language to describe what's happening.
Yeah. Now, what I've read about your background also is that you had no television until age 14, which is today would be considered cruel and unusual punishment prohibited by the Constitution, but nevertheless.
Well, we thought it was back then, too. But it wasn't up to us. And I think about that now, and I'm grateful for it. There's, I don't know how many people here remember reading the Little House on the Prairie books growing up. I would imagine they were pretty popular, but we read those, and I think quite a lot about Laura's sister, Mary, who eventually went blind, and how Laura had to describe the world to her, and I have to believe that that was a huge factor in her becoming the great writer that she became. And so for us, any time that would have been spent watching TV was either spent playing outside or reading, or in some cases listening to the radio, where you're having things put into words. And I have to believe that had a major effect on my development and helped me get the chance to become a better writer, just because there were all those hours that weren't spent passively watching television.
Now, a lot of older people remember Paul Harvey, and you do too, right? I mean, and
yeah.
Maybe you could tell about and now the rest of the story.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Paul Harvey was a very well-known radio host back decades ago for a long time, and he used to do this daily feature called The Rest of the Story. It came on News Radio WGST in Atlanta every day, something like 4:30, and it was really not very long, just about 5 minutes, and it would be this very surprising story, usually about a mysterious place or figure, and then always at the very end he would reveal who it was he had been talking about all along, whether it was, and that man was Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Andy Griffith or whoever it was, and and I always found it fascinating. And there's some element of that I think that is still at play for me now in what I do, because when I go out reporting, that's what I'm trying to find out, is the rest of the story, the part that happened after all the other reporters left, or after the TV cameras went away. Even if it's something that happened 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago, the story is always continuing. It's always evolving, and a lot of times getting better over the years.
What were the advantages and disadvantages of being a PK, a preacher's kid?
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't really know any other way of being, I guess. Just that was the way it was. Growing up, there was never a question. We were going to church where Dad preached every Sunday. Maybe it was harder after I left home and lived in a different city. Then it was a question of, well, what do I do now that I have my own choice? And actually what happened is I didn't go to church at all for about 10 years. It took me a while to figure out what I wanted.
So I want to come to that, but let me just now, going up to, in upstate New York, writing your first newspaper story at age 17 for the local paper. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I used to have a route where I carried this ink-stained canvas bag on my shoulder, and it was bitterly cold in the winter there, and so one day, a lady named Doris invited me in to get warm, and she told me that she wrote historical novels. And I said, well, could I write about you for the paper? And she said, sure. So I walked into the publisher's office and said, I would like to write a story. Well, what I didn't realize then, but since I came to realize, is that there's nothing the editor of a daily newspaper wants more than copy, especially if it's not very expensive. And so he said, sure, go right ahead. And it was very nice to.
And you were already an employee as a paper boy.
That's true.
Basically delivering the newspapers. So.
Exactly. So I wrote the story and used some, I'm sure, very overwrought language, and tried to, I think I used the word whence, maybe even correctly, I don't know. But it's not one that I would hold up as a paragon of quality journalism. But it was the first try. Everyone has to have a first try, and so the next day I made sure that whenever I saw a subscriber, I said, "Look what I did." It was a magical moment.
Yeah. And then you go to Gordon College, and what did you major in there?
Communication arts with a concentration in journalism. So it wasn't technically a journalism degree, but I got to have my first internship there with the Salem News, a small paper in Salem, Massachusetts, Witch City, USA. It had a picture, a little graphic of a little red witch riding a broom on the cover every day. And that was the paper.
Yeah. And while there, you're going to chapel and so forth. Okay, but then you graduate, you're off on your own, and then there's this 10-year period where you're not going to church.
That's right.
And why, although I can maybe guess, but tell it why, and then what happened over this time that eventually you wanted to start going to church again?
Yeah, I guess the thing I found out is I sort of started at the very beginning. In my journalism career, in the sense that it was a twice-weekly paper in South Georgia, and I knew that if I was going to go from there to some place that I was really excited to get to, I knew there would have to be a bunch of steps in between, and it turned out, indeed, there were. I was in Jessup, Georgia, then back up in eastern Massachusetts, then down in Jacksonville, Florida, then in Pasco County, Florida, and then back up to Atlanta. And so each place I really didn't feel very connected to the community. It all felt very temporary, and so each week it would be, well, I'll try to go to a different church next week, and the next week it was next week, and it got easier and easier not to go. It's sort of like a muscle anyway. You know, you don't use it, it atrophies, and so I think that's what happened. I sort of, I guess, got out of the habit of that, and it took a while to really remember and to feel like, okay, now it's time to settle in.
Okay. So you're yo-yoing up and down the East Coast, various newspapers, covering all sorts of stuff. I mean, as a rookie, a cub reporter in a sense, fires and crimes and all sorts of things. What did you, when you think back to those several years of newspaper reporting, what was most useful in that?
Well,
besides getting paid.
Yeah, that's the number one thing. But I guess it was a chance to find out really how big the world is, how much I didn't realize that I didn't know. I'm not saying that I lived a sheltered life growing up. I mean, I guess you could argue that. But a lot of what was actually happening out there, there's a big difference between reading about it in a book and actually seeing it. And so the beauty of working in newspapers is that I was forced to get out there and watch people in action and see how decisions get made, see how government works, see how a police investigation is done, see people in these moments of great emotion, you know, whether they've just lost someone, a loved one in a car wreck, or you know, had some sort of major success. And to me, it was an education in how the life and how the world really works. And I wouldn't trade that for anything, because anytime I do a story now, I am drawing from that reserve of experience of being out in the middle of history being made.
Which of those, I think there were, 4 different newspapers
Yes.
you worked for? Which of those did you, which job did you like the most of those 4?
Well, each one had its own advantages. I guess it had been my dream since about age 17 to write for the St. Petersburg Times. My mom bought me a book, an autobiography by a writer named Rick Bragg, who had written for the New York Times. He had won a Pulitzer Prize. He was a kid from rural Alabama who went on to make it good in newspapers. And in that book, he talked about his experience at the St. Petersburg Times, and it just sounded like an amazing, wonderful place where you could go and do anything. And so it was my goal for several years to get there. And 5 years after college, I actually did. They finally said, yes, we'll give you a job here. So I went there, and it was so I would say that was my favorite job, but it was a strange job too. I was covering the crime beat in Pasco County, which is on the Gulf Coast of Florida, north of Tampa Bay, and it's a strange place in that hardly anyone there is actually from there, you know, and there's all kinds of strange crime being committed. In a period of barely 18 months, I wrote about a habitual traffic violator who literally had no arms and only one leg, a woman who faked her death and then attended her own funeral, sitting in the back of it, a woman who was reported missing only to be discovered in her own home. She had died. She had fallen behind a bookcase, and the house was such a terrible mess that people hadn't even noticed that there was a body decomposing there.
It happens.
You know, there was another one about counterfeiters who found a way to bleach the markings off, I think it was $1 bills, and then reprint them as $20 bills. There was a guy who was hungry, and he went out in the woods and shot a woodpecker and got in big trouble for that. Actually, that's the guy who, out of anyone I've ever interviewed before, that's the guy I feel the most sorry for, because he was a kid. He was probably like 19 years old, and he was out of money, and he didn't have any food in his refrigerator, and he literally just went out looking for a meal. But the problem was he was trespassing, and I think the gun was improperly registered. So even though he did shoot the woodpecker, he didn't get a chance to actually eat it before he was arrested. And,
tastes like chicken, they say.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I went and interviewed him, and he was just very, very pitiful. And I said, well, Nick, what would you like the most? He said, I really would love a seafood platter, some type, fried shrimp, lobster, all that kind of thing. And I wasn't making a whole lot of money at the time, but I said, well, call me when you get out of jail, and I'll buy you a seafood platter. But he never called. So, Nick, if you're out there, I still owe you that seafood platter.
So, did you do some sports writing in the process? Or?
Really none. No, just
Okay.
played a lot of sports and watched a lot. But my first story for SI was, other than I think one high school football game in Jessup, Georgia, it was the first sports story that I had done. And so people will come along, young journalists or people in college, and they'll say, well, how do I get into sports writing? And what I always tell them is that I think it could be a mistake to wall yourself off into this one specialty so early. I think the thing that serves me the most isn't so much a knowledge of sports, but is the ability to go and dig out a story, the ability to find sources and find the right public records, track people down and sift through things and sort out all the evidence and try to get to the truth. And that's going to serve you almost really no matter what you're writing about. And so that's why I encourage anyone, even if they want to get into sports writing, try reporting the news for a few years first.
And so, what led you? You're age 28 when you catch on with Sports Illustrated? Is that?
That was how old I was when I wrote my first freelance story.
Your first freelance. So, why Sports Illustrated? Why were you working on that? And how did you make the contact with Sports Illustrated?
Yeah. It was a magazine that I had always enjoyed reading growing up. My grandfather had bought a subscription for me and my brother when I was about 10 years old. And the writing in it was so good that my mom, who enjoys sports probably less than anyone in the world, actually used to steal it from the mailbox and read it before we could. And so it was something that I had always thought of, but it seemed like this distant, impossible dream. Could I write for Sports Illustrated? Well, around 2008, I had been in newspapers for 7 years. It felt like a pretty good amount of time, and I got the idea, I want to try something a little different now. I want to try magazine writing, and the first magazine that came to mind was Sports Illustrated. And so I had a sort of a hero there, a writer by the name of Gary Smith, winner of 4 National Magazine Awards, very, very successful. And I thought, maybe Gary Smith can help me. And I had no good reason to think that. I never met the guy, never read an interview with him, never knew anyone else who knew him. But I just thought, well, if I'm going to reach out to somebody there, it's going to be him, because I love the work that he does. It's just so beautifully done. So I went to the Sports Illustrated website, wrote a little fan letter in a form that you could fill out on the website, press submit, and hoped that it would get to him. Didn't really think it would, but it did. And amazingly, about 2 days later, he wrote back. He wrote a very kind note. I found out later that he writes back to everyone, no matter who writes him, and often very long and thoughtful notes. But I sent him a story that I had done, and he liked it, and got on the phone to the boss in New York and said, maybe you should give this kid a chance. to do a freelance story. And so they did. And the remarkable thing was that not only had he first returned my letter and then helped me get the story, but then after I wrote the story and I sent it to him, and he correctly recognized that it wasn't very good, he helped me fix it. He spent about 6 hours on the phone with me, going back and forth until it was as good as it could be. And then I turned it in, and the editors loved it, and it won an award. And Gary had told me, this is a one-time thing. You know, after this, you're on your own. And so ever since then, whenever I write a story, I try to think, okay, can I do this by myself better than the one that Gary Smith helped me write?
Okay. And you've written some exceptionally wonderful stories. And by the way, I recommend to all of you, it's kind of nice on SI.com, Sports Illustrated's website, they have an SI vault. And you can go in there and you can read a whole lot of stories, including stories about murderers, stories about wonderful things like just tell us about the softball players in the state of Washington. Because
Sure.
again, there are a lot of good stuff, but this is a sweet story.
Yeah. So back in, I guess this was 2008 as well. It was briefly front page news in a lot of papers, and I think it was on ESPN. There was a college softball game out in Washington State, women's college softball. A girl came up to bat, and she'd never hit a home run in her life before. And she takes a swing and hits it over the fence, and it's this magical moment for her. Well, she's so excited that as she's running around the bases, she misses first base. And her coach says, come back, Sarah. So she turns to come back and tears her ACL. Just hears this terrible popping sound, and she falls down in the dirt. And now all of a sudden, nobody knows what to do. Her teammates want to help her, but they're being told by her coach, don't touch her, or she'll be out. And the umpires...
The rules are you cannot help.
All right, you can't help your teammate around the bases. She's got to do it herself. And the umpires don't even know what to do. They're confused. They're trying to look through the rule book. They don't know what rules apply here. They're saying, well, then I guess she won't be able to score the run because she couldn't cross home plate. And there's this big confusion. And what finally happens is that the girl playing first base for the other team, she goes up to the umpire and she says, well, what if we carry her? And the umpire said, well, I don't know of any rule against that. And so these two girls for the other team, they pick up this girl and they carry her on the bases, helping her to score the run that counts against them, and they're ultimately eliminated from the playoffs. But this girl, Mallory Holtman, it was her idea to do it, and she said, look, it was just the right thing to do. She earned it, and we wanted to make sure she got what she had earned. And so I wanted to write a story about who this girl was and what made her do a thing like that. And it was a fascinating experience.
So I read that when you're starting to write a story, you'll take a regular old 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and you'll put it in front of you and you'll sometimes write one word on it that conveys the essence of the story you want to write. Could you talk about your process of framing like that?
Yeah, well, in any story, I might have, if you count all the newspaper clippings electronically and typed notes and everything else, it could add up to, 200, 300, or 400 pages in a Word document. So it's a huge amount of material, and there has to be some way to sift that and say, okay, what's going to guide the 1% that I pick out of this, or maybe it's not 1, maybe it's 5 or 10%, but it's just a very small percentage. How am I going to choose what's the best material and what fits the best? And so one way to do that is to say, okay, well, what's the theme here? You know, what's this story really about? And so in the case of the story that I just described, I actually don't remember what the one word was, but I do know that I do remember a word that was floating around in my head at the time. Like I mentioned, I love to read good novels, and I had recently read East of Eden by John Steinbeck, which is a beautiful book. I would recommend it to anyone. And there's a word in there, timshel, Timshel. It's actually a biblical reference, and it means "thou mayest." And so there was something about that that was very powerful to me. The idea that this girl, Mallory Holtman, she felt like she had permission to do that it was okay for her to do that. And so what I tried to find out, and really did find out, is what it was in her life that put her in that position. And so I was able to find out about her background and how much her two parents loved her and supported her, and how her coach had taught her that winning was not actually the most important thing, that playing the game right was. And so all these things had sort of come together in her mind to let her make that crucial decision when the moment was right.
So here a biblical word, in a sense, helps you focus on that. But let me ask, in your writing and in your career so far, what difference has it made that you have belief in Christ?
Well, I think back to the first story I had to write for SI, 2 on 5. I had written a draft of it already and shown it to my wife, and her name is Sarah. I often show her what I've written before I turn it in, and she looked at it and she said, that's not very good. And she's a very good judge of that, and a lot of times she likes what I do, but this time it wasn't enough, and especially the first sentence, what we sometimes call the lead, it just wasn't right. And so I knew I had to rewrite that, and I basically one Saturday just sort of locked myself in the spare bedroom, and I thought, how can I make this story feel the way it should feel? And by the way, the story was about this moment of glory, about these two boys who won a basketball game that they had no business winning, very miraculous, and about how that glory was fleeting and how it didn't last, and it just sort of faded away. And I thought, okay, well, how can I give that feeling to this story? And so I remembered my favorite chapter from the Bible, which is Ecclesiastes 12. And it's some of the most beautiful poetry that I've ever read. And I just remember opening to that chapter and reading it over and over again. And finally getting the inspiration that I felt that I needed, and writing the sentence, the first sentence of the story, which was probably, one of the best I'd ever done. And it was because I sort of could draw from that that great writing that was already there. So I don't even know if that answers your question right, but it's an example, I guess, of how I was able to find inspiration when I needed it the most.
So you have a lot of independence as a senior writer for Sports Illustrated. You, as I understand it, you choose particular stories you're interested in doing. You query the editor. Often they say yes, sometimes they say no. Are there particular types of stories that you gravitate towards because of your worldview that otherwise you would not, or you might like other types of stories? Have you ever tried to analyze your process of story selection?
I've definitely thought about it a good bit, and it does seem as if I try to go after. It's very often a story that there's some element of someone doing something heroic at a certain cost to themselves. That element comes up again and again. Often when I'm not even looking for it. Sometimes it'll arise during just the process of going out and doing the reporting. So I'll give you an example of that. Back in 2007, 6 years ago, there was a player for the Denver Broncos named Darren Williams. And there were headlines made because there had been a party at a nightclub in Denver, and shots had been fired into this guy's limousine, and he was killed. And in the media reports afterwards, it was easy just to get a very simple impression of Darren Williams, to come away and say, well, he was behaving in a risky way, he was out with bad characters, he was flaunting his wealth, probably shouldn't do that, the end. And so there are some people who looked at it that way, and you could see why. But talking before about how reporting helped me to see the world in a more complex way, in a more nuanced way, this story is a good example of that, because eventually I found a bunch of the guys who were with him in the limo that night. And they told me a story that was much more sort of surprising and complicated than the initial one that had come out. And I didn't just want to believe what they told me, so I ran this past the lead detective and the prosecutor in the case, because it had already been tried and everything, and they confirmed that it was true. This was really what happened. So what happened is that Darren Williams, he wasn't the aggressor that night. He hadn't really started the fight. And in fact, he was in his limousine ready to leave and get away scot-free. And if he had chosen to just leave then, we wouldn't have heard about him. He just would have gone on and had a successful career, would have just blended into the background. But he looked out the back window of his limo that night, and he saw a teammate who had caused some of the trouble, now in trouble with some gang members out there and needing help. And he told his limo driver, stop. And the limo driver stopped, and he jumped out of the limo, and he went to go help his friend. And in that ensuing controversy, the bad guy, the one with the gun, got confused about whose limo was whose, and ultimately fired into Williams' limo at what he apparently believed was the other guy, but it turned out to be him. And so that was a case where, you could say Williams made some bad decisions, and he did. But a big reason he died is because he was loyal to his friend. And it was an inspiration to me just to see that, there are lessons about courage and loyalty in places where you don't always expect.
How long have you been married now?
It'll be 8 years in July.
Okay, so there's a lot of talk these days about young men not being willing to commit. Mm-hmm. How did you decide to commit?
It took a while. It was actually, we had been together almost 5 years by the time it happened. But Sarah and I met in college. We were in the same graduating class. And in the same major, communication arts, and fell in love there, and carried on actually not one but two different long-distance relationships as I continued having to move from one job to another, and that was a really, really hard thing. But she persevered through that, and I did too. And I guess it just took me a little while to grow up enough to know that this is what I wanted and this is what I should do. And it was the right thing to do, and we've been together, almost 13 years now, and have two little children, and it's kind of a zoo at our house, but we get by. It's very rewarding too.
Okay, and is that one of the things that finally made you think, gee, you got to go to church again, or?
That may have been in the back of our minds somewhere. It also helped that we moved into a neighborhood where we knew that we were settled. We didn't feel temporary anymore. We didn't feel like, okay, we're going to get to know these people, and then 6 months later we're going to move again and they're going to be gone. We bought a house, and a former colleague of mine at Atlanta Magazine, it turned out that her husband was going to be the pastor of this brand new church that was starting out. And so it seemed like a great time for us to start over, and we've been there for about 1.5 years, and we're thrilled to be there.
Okay. Questions from y'all?
Yes. Oh, there's a microphone.
I was really thinking a lot about the situation at the Dallas Cowboys this year with Josh Brent and Jerry Brown. I would assume that you would find it interesting how Jerry Brown's mother responded, and then the Dallas Cowboys organization kind of circled Josh Brent and took their cue from her and gave her a lot of credit for grace abounding. Have you checked into that?
I followed that case a little bit, and it does seem like it could make a very good story. And I think sometimes it can get easier as a little bit of time goes by and the shock of the tragedy wears off. But that's definitely a good one to keep tabs on and go look at. You're right. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, you talked about writing for newspapers for a long time and then deciding you want to do a magazine and finding a good story. What was that transition like, writing? How did you know what would make like a good long form story as opposed to your newspaper writing? And kind of was it a bigger transition, or was it very similar?
There was a little bit of a change, but one thing that prepared me is that the culture of writing narrative journalism at the St. Petersburg Times was very strong. It was a lot of the stories we were writing then were magazine-style stories anyway, and so the transition wasn't as jarring as it could have been if it had been a different newspaper. But you're right. You have to. The bar is a little higher when you say, okay, am I going to write 5,000 words about this versus, a quick daily story for a newspaper that's 500, and so. A lot of it, I think, has to do with how deeply it fascinates you. Is it something that you lie awake at night thinking and wondering about? And if it does, if that's something that it does to you, there's a good chance it's going to be fascinating to other people too. So you can really trust your own instincts, I think. Yes.
Thomas, you wrote the story about Michael Jordan's high school coach who evidently had cut him from the varsity team. What drew you to that story, and what did you find out about that incident that was unexpected?
Yeah, when Jordan was inducted into the Hall of Fame, he gave sort of an angry acceptance speech where he lashed out at a bunch of people, including his former high school coach. And one of the things he said is, "I just wanted you to know you made a mistake, dude." And I was watching the acceptance speech and was sort of surprised by that, and it just made me wonder. It made me curious. Well, who is this guy who he's talking about? Is it the truth? And what would the coach have to say about it? And that led me on a journey to Wilmington, North Carolina, Jordan's hometown, where I found out a couple of surprising things. One is that the story was not exactly the way it had been portrayed. Jordan wasn't truly cut from a team, and also the coach had been very, very kind to him, done a lot of nice things for him, and had now fallen into mental illness and alcoholism and was basically living on the streets in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so the story I wrote was about the struggles of this coach and what were the verifiable facts of the story as compared to how it had been presented in such videos as Come Fly With Me, which of course is very popular. And so it was a privilege to be able to change some minds about this coach and hopefully speak for someone who had a hard time speaking for himself.
Traditional mainstream media is clearly evolving in a big way. I don't think the print media will ever die completely, but to be able to earn a living as a professional journalist, one must be looking in new avenues. Do you have any recommendations, particularly to those who may be here today that are studying journalism, other than affecting the world just in the blogosphere and all that? Is there a way in the future to earn a living as a journalist?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's something that has a lot of people worried, for sure, as you see certain publications stop printing and others cut staff and everything. And so there's a good reason to worry. But to me, there are some important pieces of good news. One is that people are always going to want to read true stories about the world around them. There's no way that's ever going to change. And two, people are reading those stories, and they're doing it online, so as well as in print. So it's just going to take a little while for the advertising revenue online to catch up with where it was with print. And there may be a way to do that, some of which might be paying some money as a subscriber to see certain things online. People are experimenting now, and I think it'll shake out eventually. But my advice to people just starting out is pretty simple. Sure, it can be useful to practice your writing voice, writing a blog, writing about your life and all that. If you practice writing, you're going to get better at it, so there's no reason to discourage that. But what's going to keep you in demand, keep you employed, keep editors wanting to pay you for your work, is your ability to write about things other than yourself. That is, to go out and find the truth about events, noteworthy people, and places, to build the skills of digging out the facts and putting them together in a compelling way, and to practice empathy, imagining what it's really like to be that other person, even if you might imagine at the beginning that they did something wrong or that they're not very likable. There may, in fact, be much more to the story that you'll discover if you go out and find it. And so if you practice those skills, you're much more likely to succeed in this business.
Do you think you are more introverted or extroverted?
Definitely more introverted. I was always a very shy kid growing up, and so I didn't know if I'd be able to do this work, because the foundation of this work is being able to go knock on a stranger's door and ask them for their story. And I'm still sometimes terrified when I have to do that. But the work has forced me to give it a try, and so it gets a little bit easier. And for some reason, I think a lot of journalists are actually shy, and doing this work is sort of a way to help them overcome that.
Okay.
Okay, this question's about our homeschool hero, Tim Tebow. First of all, have you had an opportunity to meet him and write about him? And secondly, obviously, he is very open about his Christianity, and he celebrates when he scores. In your opinion, how does this impact his ability going forward to actually achieve his dream, which is to play quarterback?
Yeah. I've never met Tebow. I think it would be very interesting to be able to write about him because there's a lot to look into there. You know, the question of can he be a viable NFL quarterback, but also what is the role of public faith in an athlete's life. And so there are other people who are also Christians who say, well, is he going too far? Is he pushing it? Is he making too big a public display? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that when he was winning games for the Broncos last year, I was swept up in the excitement of that, just as a lot of other people were. So, no, I don't think the Tim Tebow story is over. I think you'll be hearing more twists and turns soon. And yes, I look forward to a chance to hopefully tell a part of that story.
Mm-hmm.
Last semester, I got the opportunity to take a narrative nonfiction class and practice some of those skills that you're talking about in your reporting and your writing. So I just wanted to hear from you, from a journalist who writes narrative all the time, how you got started doing narrative, what you look for when you report, and how that's different from even basic magazine writing.
Yeah. Well, the idea of narrative journalism, I guess, it's sort of a fancy term. I like it, although some people don't like it, but it's a fancy term to describe something that we all are basically almost born understanding, just intrinsically, which is, what it basically means is that instead of writing in the so-called inverted pyramid style, where it's the most important fact, then the second most important fact, and the third most, you're deciding, okay, I'm going to write a story. And by story, that means, what do all stories have? A beginning, a middle, and an end, you know? And hopefully some compelling unanswered question that's posed near the beginning that is gradually answered throughout the story until you get to the final payoff. And so we all know this. I mean, my 2-year-old daughter knows this. I tell her one of these every night. Sometimes it's made up and sometimes it's true. But I guess what I'm looking for when I go out and try to find one of those, it is something that will really surprise the reader, or a way of strategically withholding certain information until the very end where it'll have the maximum effect. And I'll give you an example. About 4 years ago, a tornado came through downtown Atlanta, Georgia. And it happened to come through right as the SEC basketball tournament was being played. So there was a college basketball game going on, Alabama against Mississippi State. And Mississippi State was winning. Alabama had the ball and a chance to tie the game. And their best shooter, he was a guy named Mikhail Riley. He takes the shot from about 28 feet, throws it up, it bounces around the rim, comes out, hits the backboard, goes back in right at the buzzer, ties the game, sends it into overtime. Well, the miraculous thing about that is that 8 minutes later, when the tornado came roaring past the Georgia Dome, thousands of people who would have been walking outside right in the path of the tornado were instead safely inside the dome. And so it literally was a shot that saved people's lives. And that was the beginning. That was sort of the basic idea of the story. But what I found out as I dug into it is that it was even more amazing than that. It turned out that this kid who made the shot he learned to shoot on a special basketball court that had been installed with lights, overhead lighting, in his grandmother's backyard. And the only reason she was able to afford to install that court is because of a life insurance payout that she had gotten when her daughter, along with, I think, 3 other people, were shot to death by a crazy man back something like 15 years earlier. And so it was hard to know what to make of the whole thing. But the bottom line was that in this very, very bad thing that happened, a chain of events over about 15 years led to something incredibly wonderful happening. And so the challenge there was to piece it all together and to find that cause and effect from A to Z, basically. And I think I just rambled a lot. Did I answer your question? If you want to ask something to follow up, go ahead.
A quick follow-up to that. Just basic reporting, how do you dig for some of those details, and how would you find a backstory like that, just in your reporting? And
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised sometimes, even now. I'll go back and I'll listen to my recorded interviews, because I have a little digital recorder, and it's terrible. Even now, I find that I'm not listening well enough when the person is talking. I don't ask the right follow-up questions. So I think that's the number one thing for me and for anyone else, is that when someone talks, you have to really care what they're saying, to the point where you ask just the right follow-up questions. And if something hits you just right, or it's intriguing, you say, well, hold on, and you kind of pursue a line of questions down there. So in this case, the question was, well, how did he learn to shoot? And that's when his mother started talking about the basketball court. Well, that's sort of unusual, because they had mentioned that they were from kind of a poor neighborhood. Well, how could she pay for it? And it was sort of like one question led to another, led to another, led to another. So you just have to stay curious and trust that sense is going to guide you toward the most fascinating things about the story. And I'll be glad to talk with you more about that afterwards.
So most reporters, in looking at that, would see this as, a chance collection of circumstances. Did you look at this in some way, or were we thinking about this in terms of providence?
Well, it made it easier that Mikhail Riley and his parents certainly looked at it that way. And Mikhail would basically pray as he was taking every shot. And so I think there could be a danger sometimes in imposing a certain sensibility on a story when the facts don't really call for it. But in this case, it all fit together very well, because the main characters all believed that this was how it went. And so it was easy just to incorporate that into the sequence of events.
And you took those beliefs seriously. And there'd be other reporters who would think this is all a bunch of nonsense in terms of what the characters, and so that reporter might go in an entirely different direction.
That's true. I mean, there's a lot of talk about being unbiased, about being objective, not letting your own preconceptions get in the way of the story, but that's impossible. Each of us has a way we see the world and a lens, through which we view things. And so we're all going to bring a different perspective to the story. So yes, if someone else had written it, they may well have written something entirely different from what I wrote. And who knows? I'm sure it would have been very good too, but that was my chance to put my take on it.
Got one last quick question. the story you wrote about Ray Caruth, I read that you had, the one word you had there was forgiveness. Maybe you could just briefly explain what that was about, and then we'll conclude.
Sure. Very briefly, it was about a football player named Ray Caruth who had a girlfriend who was pregnant, and he didn't want her to have the child. He told her to get an abortion. When she wouldn't do that, he asked a guy to beat her up so she would have a miscarriage. When that didn't work out, he eventually had someone shoot her with the intention of having the baby killed as well. The mother died, but the baby survived. And so then the woman who died, her mother, the grandmother of the boy, was left to care for this baby who turned out to have cerebral palsy. And one of the most amazing parts about the story is that this grandmother managed to forgive Ray Caruth, and that was part of what helped her to give such complete devotion to a boy who, as time went on, looked more and more like the man who had her daughter killed. And looking at this woman's example, her name is Sandra Adams, looking at Miss Adams' example got me thinking about the different kinds of forgiveness. There's one kind that I find not too terribly hard. It's the kind where someone does something to you and you know it's not right, and they know it's not right, and eventually they come and apologize, and they ask you to forgive them, and you say, okay, and then everything's better, mostly. But then there's another kind that came into play here. Caruth never took responsibility for what he had done, never apologized in any way or acknowledged any of it, even though he was convicted. And to me, that's almost in a whole other universe, forgiving someone like that, especially with such a great loss. And so this story gave me the chance to sort of meditate on the two main kinds of forgiveness and how one is so much harder than the other. And this woman, Sandra Adams, in giving that much harder kind, freed herself in a way and managed to give her grandson the best life he could possibly have, given these circumstances.
Please join me in thanking Thomas Lake.
Thank you. Thank you.